As most of you know, in my previous life, the life before I was ordained, I served in the Air Force. I started out enlisted, first as a jet engine mechanic and later pushing cargo. However, I spent most of my 28 years in the military as a pilot, flying bombers, and at the end of my career, flying RC-135s out of Offutt. I lived my childhood dream, flying around the world, engaged in interesting and exciting missions. When Iraq invaded Kuwait back in 1990, my family and I were on vacation because we were between assignments. We had left New York, traveled down to Florida and Disney World, found ourselves heading up to Chicago to visit family, ending up in Castle Air Force Base in Central California. Yes, vacation. When the invasion hit the news, I immediately called back to my squadron commander and asked him to try and get my orders canceled so that I could be there with my crew, which, by the way, was the first crew to leave Griffiss Air Force Base for Diego Garcia. He told me, the deployments are going to be nothing more than a show of force. Go enjoy my time at Castle flying as an instructor. He told me, don't worry about this. Not really happy, I continued my journey and ended up training many of the pilots who would wind up going over and flying combat missions. And I admit I wasn't happy about that either. I felt I was being denied the opportunity to do what I trained my career to do. And I wasn't alone in my feelings. Most of the line instructors felt exactly the same way. The only place I didn't feel this growing tension, this mounting frustration, was in a little mission church my family had found themselves attending. And it would be there that I began to ask God, why? Why was I sitting on the sidelines when the rest of the world was involved in what I saw as a great endeavor? And the only answer I sensed at the time was the one children often hear when parents know that they will not understand the answer being given. Because I said so. And I admit, I didn't like that answer either. But over time, I learned to accept it. And it was only then I was able to begin to trust in someone besides myself. And as I did, I began to see why God had kept me out of action. And that God had a different plan for me in life. In God's plan, I didn't kill like I thought was right to do. And I would not live with the guilt of having done so. Instead, I was being called to help others see that the path that they think they are destined to follow, or the one they think they have no other choice but to face, may not be the path God intended for them to journey. And that when a person begins to trust in God more than we trust in ourselves, we might just see the path God has laid before us to walk. Looking back, had I insisted on doing what I thought was right, the chances are I wouldn't be standing here in front of you today. Listening to my commander's advice, and then having the common sense not to try calling the flesh peddlers to change my assignment, set me on a different path. Whether it was, as the navigators call it, a course correction, or a turn to avoid danger, it was a pivotal point in my life. And at the time, pivotal points such as these don't always make sense. It is often only as we look back we are able to see their effect. to see if the path we chose to follow was the right one or not. In today's gospel, we listen as Jesus tells about someone who faced a pivotal point in their life, but chose the wrong path. Now, preachers love to use this parable to preach about the dangers of riches, how they can make us blind to the world around us, how they are the root, wealth being the root of all evils in the world. And they do so often to guilt people who have into giving, and to make those who have wealth of any kind feel bad about what they have, and to worry about what lays ahead. Change, these preachers say, must be 180 degrees from where we are, lest we suffer in eternity, like the rich man, for not doing so. I struggle when I hear preachers or read in commentaries stress the need for such dynamic change. When I flew bombers, we flew a lot of day and night low-level missions. Missions that were well below 1,000 feet above the ground. Training to fly below radar or to use terrain to hide us from the enemy. I have flown the B-52 at altitudes below 200 feet above the ground over the deserts of Nevada. Now, if you can't remember what a B-52 looks like, there's a big green one on a pedestal sitting outside the flag gate of Offutt Air Force Base, which, by the way, was one of the first planes I flew when I was at Castle many years ago, but we won't go into detail. With proper planning, the navigator knew the safest route to guide us around the known hazards. Now, granted, there were times when unexpected threats presented themselves, and we would have to make drastic changes to avoid them, much like the drastic changes some preachers talk about we must make in life. But most of the time, all that was needed were small changes having tremendous impact. You see, it doesn't take a lot to do a lot. In flying, we have what we call the 60-to-1 rule. Some of the navigators out there can catch me on this one. What the 60-to-1 rule says is if we turn 1 degree and travel 60 miles in that direction, we will be exactly 1 mile from where we would have been otherwise. This rule is a really good tool to help us know how much correction is needed to avoid a hazard. It also helps us to see that when we deviate from the path we are supposed to be on, even by such a small margin, how we can find ourselves in a totally different place than we expected. How does all that apply to our parable today? To the rich man in the story? He was living the life he thought was right. In those days, wealth was seen as a blessing for living a good life. So it made sense that he squandered, that he indulged himself. But he missed the course correction. Jesus implies Lazarus offered. Had the rich man seen, had he heard what was being told to him, a small change in his life could have prevented him from ending up where he did. He wasn't being asked to give away all that he had been given. He wasn't being asked to take Lazarus into his house to care for him. He was just being asked to share from the blessings he had received. Earlier in Luke's account, Luke uses a whole chapter to show us what Jesus taught about money and our relationship with God. How it can come between us and God, and how when we follow follow our own heart's desire, we can walk down a path that takes us farther from God. In chapter 12, Jesus reminds us, yes, wealth is a blessing, but, he says, that to those who have received much, much will be asked. As our wealth, our blessings, as tremendous as they are not ours alone. None of us succeed solely by our own efforts, no matter how much we think we might. We've all had help. We have all listened to that small, still voice somewhere saying, "Don't worry about this. Trust me. Things will work out. Things will be what they are supposed to be." Now, we could spend an entire Bible study series unpacking what I just said, especially in the light of such feelings in the midst of joy and sorrow. But such worries in this life are short-lived. And one point I think Jesus is trying to help us see in this story of the rich man is that we should shift our focus from those short-lived things towards that which is eternal. To this end, the choices we make in this life, at those pivotal points we face, really do matter. But here's the catch. We don't always realize they are pivotal points at the time, especially when the change we are being asked to make is so small. Something I sense after sabbatical is that our parish is at a pivotal point in the life of our community. We have a choice between continuing as we always have or making a small change, a small shift that can make a big difference in the lives of those both inside and outside the four walls of our church building. This 1 or 2 degree change in how we build and strengthen relationships is what we will be discussing over 3 seminars that are coming up. Where we end up may not be that much different than where we are headed. It may not be as drastic as the rich man and Lazarus. But if we find that we have invited, welcomed, and encouraged others to come to relationship with God in and through Christ, we will, as Abraham said to the rich man, have listened to the testimony of those who pointed us in the direction we are supposed to be going, and that we are walking along the path God intended for us to walk. Amen.